you, Patrick. And thanks to Shelley and Patrick for organising this and hosting us as a sort of platform to present our research. It's always important when sort of you are working with these research questions to end up presenting them to practitioners, in our case architects and landscape architects, planners, and then also people like yourselves in sort of the government area. So yes, understanding Perth's deep structure and the need for housing density. It comes from a publication which is coming out of the CRC for Water Sensitive Cities, which has teams based in Brisbane and Perth and in Melbourne. And the book is coming out early next year, so once we finish the presentation you might want to buy it later in the year or early next year, In Time with Water, Design Studies of 3 Australian Cities. And just to give you sort of an idea of where we've been coming from, you might know George Seddon, Sense of Place, a great landscape architect and environmental thinker, who really started to understand cities, Perth, the place, from the point of view of whatever it might have been, geology, ecology, the deeper structures. And what we found, this term deep structure comes from a landscape architect based in Pennsylvania, Anne Winston Spurn. And she's sort of talked about how if we match our city's development, or we match the designs of our cities and our buildings to deep structure, we can really have something that's in harmony with the land and the water and the place. So thank you, George Seddon, for setting the footings for all this. So there's some excerpts here from the book. We've got sort of a broad look at the geology, the geological time of Australia here, the creation of the sort of Great Artesian Basin through different rising and fallings of sea levels at the time. Going down, this is in Melbourne around Ballarat, sort of tracing over old maps and finding where the swamps used to be as sort of design cues for how we might develop the city today. And then looking at, in the case of Melbourne, sort of analogous places along that sort of swampy lowland stretch along the south of Victoria, and seeing, okay, Melbourne might have looked like this at one stage. To design, a bit hard to read, but these design studies that start to really look at the city and look at the urban scale and then the building scale, the housing scale. So that's just the overview, and now on to Perth. So there's a chapter in this book, The Deep Waters of Perth, and we've started at the broadest scale you can sort of start at for the region, which is sort of the tectonic relationships of the area. And we can overlay onto that some of the topography, and then we can overlay the building footprint of Perth, which you can see in there. And what we see is something quite extraordinary, and that's that Perth is on the edge of the oldest landscape, the most ancient landscape in the world, the Yilgarn Craton. We know that because up on the Murchison, up in here, they found the oldest rock in the world, 4.4 billion years old, in a zircon deep in the ground. And this is the Darling Scarp. This is the edge on which Perth, the sedimentary coastal plain, is formed. And you're up on the Scarp here at Whistle Park Gully up in the Perth Hills, looking out onto this huge sedimentary plain. And we've got to remember that water is critical here in the creation of this landscape, and it's critical in how we understand and we build today, which we'll get to in this presentation. So there we are, the Swan Coastal Plain. So in fact, you can divide all of Australia into these blocks and these basins. Blocks form the catchments, the bits the water fall onto or the rivers flow through, and the plains are these sedimentary build-ups over time of clay and sand. So here's Perth, and you can see there that very strong, pronounced Darling escarpment and the fault line running through there, and then this very pronounced linear coastal plain. And it explains the urban form of the city, doesn't it? It explains why we're a city that continues to sprawl north and south and hug the coastline in the way we do. But there's an interesting thing at work. When we're up in the Darling Scarp and we're looking down onto these flows of water through the Serpentine Falls here, you think at one stage these flows have been actually enormous. There's been glacial meltings and there's been differences in sea level that have been brought about by these glacial meltings across the world, but it's formed these huge crevices. So we look at the surface water river systems today and we see the ones that have been dammed here. We can kind of end up tracing the flows of where they might have gone back through when we look at the clay geologies. This is then the clay geologies of the Swan Coastal Plain. So you can see the Swan River running through there, but then we can see there's some clay geologies running down to the Peel Inlet, and you can trace the Serpentine River back through where it might have once flowed, the Murray River, the Avon, the Moor. So we can start to look at the landscape as one that's defined by water. And then of course out to sea, the fascinating Perth Canyon, where we can look at that enormous sort of 15-kilometre long, 3-kilometre deep crevice in the seabed. You can actually imagine once upon a time that was connecting there to the Swan River and sort of an outflow of sediment to the ocean. So these are the clays. These are the clays of the Swan Coastal Plain, the clay layers of the Swan Coastal Plain shown here. And when we're up closer to the foothills, this is at the Brixton Street wetlands. The Brixton Street wetlands are particularly incredible because they are one of the most biodiverse areas in the country, actually. They have close to 600 unique floral species, and a bunch of those are only found in this sort of area. But here we're on a clay pan, so we've got a huge sort of array of surface clays that come down from the scarp and form these environments. And then there's the other agent, if you like. You've got the clays that come down from the flows of these rivers over many, many millennia, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, geological timescales. And then you've got the other agent, which is the ocean. So at different points in time, the ocean has been up at the Darling Scarp, halfway along the plain, and we kind of have this is the source of these different dunal systems that we get that sit along the Swan Coastal Plain. And there's a point about sort of 10,000 years ago, which is very actually well recorded in Noongar stories, when one could walk out to the Rottnest Island. And then today. So we go up to Moore River and we look out onto the banks of the river there, and that's kind of a picture of what Perth might once have looked like, as are these amazing limestone edges which we still see across the city. So we're developing this story kind of for a practical reason, and that is that we're trying to create a narrative here of Perth being built up of, it's often said that Perth's on a whole bunch of dunes, and that's true, but it's also got a whole bunch of clays. And those clays are on the surface, but those clays, because of the times and the timescales of movement, those clays are also below the surface, and we've got subsurface clays, as many of you will know. We've created a reconstruction then of these wetlands that used to run up and down the Swan Coastal Plain, and this is from some of the geological information around silts and clays and peats, but it's also from the groundwater information, so we can construct this view of the tapestry of wetlands that once flowed along. And an early photograph here at Clays Brook, Clauses Brook, of what that wetland outflow looked like in 1861. So at some scale we can then zoom in on these maps and we can overlay images of the city. Here we've got basically Kingsford Lake and Thompson and Hughes and Stones and all these lakes that once sat around the Perth CBD. So today we're down in here, but we can see this landscape and start to read this landscape as a hydrological one. Which of course Stirling did, and he did it partly because he was a great salesman and was trying to sell the area to the British. But there was also a very strong, you can see the abundance of fresh water, many fresh springs. The presence of water in this landscape was not only important to the indigenous people, the Noongar people of the region, but also to the early settlers. And here's an image there of the reeds of the Swan River kind of towering above them. So we build up this picture then, and this history. This is all the market gardens in 1953. So that's the swamp chain that runs from Clays Brook up to Kareem through Lake Munger and Herdsman and well up. And these were the market gardens at that same period. So you've got a whole history that's founded around these hydrologies. And then of course the groundwater contours and the groundwater mounds, and the fact that each of these wetlands are formed by essentially a mound of groundwater that sits beneath the ground. And I think these, often we might think of groundwater not as something sort of interesting or enticing, but if we start to understand it as something quite incredible, which it is, because Perth's very different to other Australian cities in the way it has these aquifers beneath it, we might start to be able to sort of protect them, understand them, come to work with them. So then here's this image of the groundwater mounds beneath the surface, and they form the wetlands on the surface, of course. So sections were done of these in the 90s as they started to be understood as sort of a whole tiered system of aquifers. And what you see there are the sort of confining beds. Those red bits are those black parts are the confining beds. So at some point in time, clays have come down, and then sands have come over, and clays have come down, and sands have come over that geological time frame we were talking about. And you've got this whole system of aquifers that sits beneath the ground. And the numbers here are quite incredible. You've got the Yarragaddy aquifer, the lowest aquifer there, being up to 95 degrees Celsius, up to 40,000 years old, water in there, this phenomenal age, and then sort of capacity of more than 1,000 cubic kilometres. And these are figures from the 90s, but a Sydney harbour is half a cubic kilometre, so this is not to say we by any means should use it, but it's sort of a way of conceiving and coming to recognise what the landscape is here. So yes, then an image of these superficial aquifers. And back in history there are sort of these early understandings of where water could be found, how many gallons, what distances, and some breachings of that, early breachings of that Yarragaddy aquifer, the Dalkeith, you have the hot springs that sat there on the edge of the Swan River and ended up being closed because of nudity, of course. It's quite an interesting piece of our history. So yes, practically speaking, obviously we can then create a depth to water table, terrain, depth from terrain to water table map. And we've been working, one of the great things about working with the CRC is we can work with people in other areas. We've worked with Carolyn Alden and the groundwater team at UWA on sort of talking about the relationship between urbanisation and this depth to groundwater phenomena. So here you've got low groundwater and high groundwater, and how that relates to coastal plain. The urban footprint of Perth over the top of that now. And then back to this clay and sandy geology, you can see really Perth's developed largely on the sands. So here's some typologies: sandy low groundwater and clay high groundwater. And these are combining those geological information with the depth to groundwater tables to produce these maps. And interestingly, we've been able to take information from the bore lithology data as well to work out where those subsurface clays are, because that really changes the nature of the flows in the ground. So what we've done then is, this is out of sort of directions 2031 and other Department of Planning documents, but really starting to look at where Perth's heading in terms of its urban footprint, and working out that in fact a lot of these areas, as you'll know, are clay high groundwater areas, and so really a need to start to consider the building types and the different typologies we can draw on to design in these sort of fringe environments. But importantly, obviously, try to turn back that urban sprawl and think about how we can both design and build in the central metropolitan area while repairing the ecologies and the hydrologies. And obviously that's what this sort of sprawl is looking like, because now the common way of doing it is to fill the land and bench the land with largely, and then obviously looking at the places Perth is moving into and finding that there are several intensities there, environmental and ecological, that we need to start to consider. And bringing back, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the sort of work of Ian McCarg and others, but bringing back some of this environmental kind of idea around planning into the mix. It takes us then to the central metropolitan area, which is where we're saying, if you build here, there are so many benefits. And if you can design good medium density infill housing, which Jeffrey will talk about in a minute, there are so many benefits. So we've run design studios. Sorry, that's just a picture of Canning there along the river. We've run design studios at UWA with master students, and we've looked at Canning. Here's the kind of drainage and environmental, hydrological context of that administrative boundary there. And interestingly, it's a great place to test these ideas around medium density infill housing, because you've got both the sandy low groundwater area at one side of the city and a clay high groundwater area at the other side of the city. So the students started to draw the landscape, as we do in architecture and landscape architecture, and think about, okay, in a natural environment, some of the water falls, it lands on the trees, a bunch of the water ends up in the ground, and you've kind of got this natural balance of things. And they started to draw the sandy areas where the aquifer sits at some depth below, and the bores and the soak wells work to draw on this kind of water cycle. And then they started to look at the really interesting drawings. This is one of the Perth CBD from I think it's from the 1970s, so it's all in feet, but you see how these clay layers work, and if you put soak wells there, where does the water go? The water goes straight down to the Swan River. And so we started to develop this picture of canning, which is using some of the data from the bore logs and all kinds of other work that Carolyn's team at UWA have been doing. If you create soak wells and you're close to an ecological environment, that water tends to flow to the wetland, and that transport is sort of lateral rather than downwards. So with this knowledge, the students started to develop some medium density infill typologies and really interesting medium density infill examples. So this was one particular student who had a clayey site, and instead of benching the land and getting rid of existing trees and so forth, this is in Ferndale, which is a suburb of Canning, in the city of Canning. Instead of benching the site and bringing in sand and getting rid of existing trees, this student looked at very lightweight typologies. This student looked at how footings could be reduced, how water could be incorporated as part of the kind of landscape, how it could be retained through water tanks and the like, and then explored lightweight building typologies. And these have real potential in Perth, but I think we're still kind of coming on to the potentials that they might actually have, both for high groundwater areas, but also for retaining ecology landscape. And again, we sort of talk to the students about where our water is coming from, and I don't need to mention this to this audience, but to a lot of architects and landscape architects and other people at the university who we've spoken to about this work. It's sometimes a surprise to them that amount of water, relatively speaking, is being drawn from the hills and from desalination. 2016 data. We also told the students this, who often didn't realise that, and then they started to think about ways of, how you can bring the water and localise those cycles, and that's one of the principles of what we've been working on with the CRC, is how the area or the precinct can be its own catchment for water. And obviously this gets easier if you've got a medium density development and you've got a lot of dwellings, and you can start to really capitalise on the potentials there. The courtyard model, infill dwelling, and how you could maybe store water beneath within the courtyard designs, and then infiltration. And the students on the sandy site were talking about how you make infiltration and how you design the whole site, how you retain the trees, but then how you allow enough, as much water as possible to go through to the ground. And so here we're talking about permeable paving and all kinds of other design elements. And this is just an image of that student's work on the Bentley site. So an important thing here was developing then typologies to try and think about medium density, and when we're encountering different sites around the central metropolitan area, being able to draw on a whole database and a library of different ways of doing medium density design instead of the kind of the maximisation of yield, instead of either design quality or environmental amenity. Jeffrey.
Thanks, Daniel. I've been involved with the CRC from its outset, really, and I was part of what was called D5.1, which was involved with water-sensitive urban design. And we found ourselves looking more and more at the issue of infill housing as a key component in developing water-sensitive urban design. And as a result of that work and others being aligned with what we were doing from within the CRC, we have now morphed into what's called IRP4, the Integrated Research Project number 4, which is all about infill housing. And I'm working with colleagues at Monash University, also part of the CRC, and we're developing a kind of library of typological options within medium density that are suitable for different contexts. And we're driven by documents like this, with which most of you will be familiar. And of course we have a number of projections in this document. And one target that is established is that 47% of all the new dwellings between now and 2050 will be in the form of residential infill, meaning we build within the current boundaries of the metropolitan area, filling in sites, either sites that are not yet built on, or we consolidate by having increased density on sites that have been built on. This is what we continue to do, and 53% of all of our new dwellings are designated to be in this form. We would keep pushing into quite delicate, sensitive bushland, coastal bushland often, because of the way we are developing up and down the coast. And as Daniel said, we bring sand in and we bench. And you can see exactly that happening here. And the irony of all this is that we're running out of sand. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens when we do reach that point. The other issue surrounding what's happening as we push out is the qualitative experience of living in these houses. We are a society that is committed largely to the idea of the detached house. And there are a whole lot of very good reasons for that. And it dates back to when we were first settled. This was a great attraction about coming out to the Swan River colony. But the nature of the detached house that we're now building, I'd argue, is causing the loss of many of the amenities that we once sought in that single house. So this is a very recent development up at Jindalee, and we can see the houses next to one another, where there is no usable outdoor space. There is very little opportunity for solar access to three sides of these residences. There is little opportunity for good cross-ventilation. So we build them and we air condition them. We don't see many solar panels on the roof yet. The other thing we don't see much of course, are trees. So in building like this, we are not achieving the ambitions of what our earlier suburbs did achieve very successfully. And that's a result of houses having grown in size. We expect now much larger houses than we were once prepared to accept. And the lot size is shrinking. So we have a series of problems there that need to be solved. And when we look at what's happening in the metropolitan area, we do see the level of infill that is occurring. And it is quite substantial over a 28-year period. You can see on the right just how much infill has occurred. And if you look closely at it, you can also imagine the quality of some of that, some of the amenity that has been provided in this infill. And this is a slide I often use in presentations because it demonstrates what is happening, or what has happened in a number of our infill redevelopments around the city of Perth, where we come in and take a site such as this one, and our first aim is to maximise the yield that that site can offer, and then we use what we understand, which is the traditional single detached house, and we bunch them together in a way that squeezes the space out of them. So there is no, again, no opportunity for useful external space. The only external space really that is usable is used for getting cars into the double garages, which form the facades of each of these houses. And again, you look at these sites where that development has occurred and there are no trees. The only trees are on the existing single residential sites. So something is going terribly wrong in the way we have been pursuing our infill, and we're looking to develop approaches that overcome these kinds of problems. Just to demonstrate that that wasn't an isolated example, if you go into a Google aerial search, you will see any number of those instances. Now, while our target is 47%, we're not achieving that. In fact, we're nowhere near achieving it, and the problem therefore compounds. And what we do achieve, which has been hovering around that 28 to 34% over the last few years, 60% of it is in the form of single detached housing. So we're not consolidating, we're simply putting in more stock. It's also worth noting that Perth has the lowest infill target of all Australian cities. Adelaide Central is up to 85% and 70% overall, and they actually achieve that target. So we need to do things a little better. And it's a national concern, the development of more types that can fit between what we understand as the single residential and the apartment block, and it's called commonly the missing middle. It's worth noting these percentages, 79%, and these may have changed a little since these numbers were drawn out, but 79% of Australians live in detached dwellings and 21% live in multiple dwelling. We have an appalling level of funding of housing from the public sector, and from the point of view of my profession, very little design input. It says less than 10% of housing has architectural involvement. My understanding is it's closer to 2 to 3%. So why do I raise that? And part of the reason for raising that is the view that design quality can make a real difference to how people accept higher density housing. 10 years ago I co-edited a book with Simon Anderson which we called Take 7, and we invited a number of architects to put forward proposals about how good design intelligence could actually improve how we infill our suburbs. And I liked this example in particular, which came from the firm of architects in Sydney, Neeson and Murphy, where they proposed putting in place on what was a single residential lot a series of triplexes. So we see a footprint of one here, we see a footprint of one here, and a footprint of one here. The argument is that once you triple the density in this way, you are releasing more funds for a local authority to invest in the public realm and make the public realm a place that people wish to inhabit rather than a place that people simply drive through to get to their car bays. So the intention here was to develop what becomes like a linear park through which people can drive slowly to access their car bays, and which can incorporate a number of different things on the street. I'll go forward to that. So we have some fixed recreational opportunities, seating, bike paths, walking paths, and of course massive growth of trees and stormwater storage. And as I said, I was attracted to the proposition because it offers a typological approach that could be repeated in any number of suburban settings. But we don't do this because we don't coordinate our infill processes. For those of you who are interested in the closer detail of design, the design of these individual units really do deserve close examination. They're very cleverly resolved, and they're able to suit a variety of household types. So you can get young people in there, you can get elderly people in there, small families, single individuals. They're adaptable to a range of options. And they have, at the front, some shared amenity, like a plunge pool, a recreational room where you get your family over for dinner, a workshop, and the car parking is distributed, with a view that car use will diminish over the years. When I was working in Melbourne, I commissioned people at Monash University to look at, again, how some good design thinking might affect the way the business as usual infill was operating in Melbourne. And they did some very close analysis. These are just small examples of what they looked at, of what was happening in the kind of inner ring of Melbourne, that inner ring that was 5 to 15 kilometres out of the city. So we took actual examples, we redrew them, and we looked at what might happen with some different design thinking that was brought to bear, attempting to achieve the same level of yield that the market was achieving. And it really wasn't that difficult to come up with propositions that we felt offered a significantly better outcome. So this is one such where we looked at the option of sites that were back-to-back. We worked within the existing res codes there, so we weren't doing anything that was challenging other codes. The codes allowed us to go up to 3 floors, and so we took advantage of that option. We also looked at how you might get the height in the centre of the site, so you least affect neighbouring houses. And one of the key things we tried to do was to ensure that there was a really good patch of land for each dwelling unit, for deep soil planting, and a deck that sat above a single level part of the house, so that there were 2 options for people to get outside and enjoy the environment. The houses were of a width that allowed easy cross ventilation and a large number of external walls that allowed very good solar penetration. And you can see here where the little lumps at the top allowed the potential of a 3rd floor to go up. We also looked at the potential of an as-is expectation in terms of cars. So in each instance we had the potential of 2 cars per unit, which is the expectation now out there in the suburban setting. As that expectation diminished and maybe it came down to 1 car per bay, and those spaces become used for other kinds of purposes. And further, when you reach a point where you might say 6 units, as we have on the site, share 2 cars that are parked in that setting, this then becomes converted into a usable recreation space, as does this as a kids' playground and this as a productive garden. So it was looking at projecting over time how the site might be used as cultural use expectations changed. And that's the type that we developed for that. Situation where you had the back-to-back block, another one where you had side-by-side block, and a triple block. And that report that was generated by Monash is downloadable and freely available from the Office of the Victorian Government Architects website for anyone who's interested. We then went on and looked at what might happen if you started coordinating infill development across a particular precinct, and the potential of linking sites and creating more permeable super lots, the option of parklets and shared opportunities that could come, whereas here we see the more opportunistic single developments that occur without any attempt to connect or relate. We also looked at the potential of how you might start queuing the development of linear parkland in streets, and how that might grow out from where the development is initiated. And this was looked at. Monash developed this proposal for the Office of Housing in Victoria, looking at properties that were owned by that office and how that might work for them. And of course, water-sensitive urban design is always part of the thinking in these precinct developments that we're putting forward. So these were the kind of principles that we were working with, and the Office of Housing was very interested in this proposal and how you might develop much better public space as an outcome. Parking is a huge issue, as you probably all know, when it comes to higher density housing, and often sites, the layout of sites, are determined on the basis of how the parking will work. We retain that expectation of having at least 1 car associated with our bay. Whereas if we lived in an apartment, we'd accept that we're parking in the basement and we're actually having to travel to our unit. That concept is not yet embedded in more suburban infill settings. We then spoke to what was then the Office of Housing here in Perth and indicated what we had done with the Office of Housing in Melbourne. Sorry, it was the Housing Authority. And they said, well, let's have a look at a piece of land where we've got large land ownership and it is a water sensitive area. So we had a look at Redcliffe for them, and we came up with a set of propositions. The area that we were looking at was just in here. And when you look at the this aerial shot, you can see just how well located this land is in terms of relative relationship to the city, to the river, and what will be a railway station in this location. So this is very strategic land, and at the moment it's largely single residential. There are some patchy infill developments going on of no great quality. The yellow indicates the ownership of what was the Housing Authority, now communities, and we were asked to look at a particular part of this larger site, and what we did was to propose that this connecting street here be converted into that linear path. Part of it is already closed off, and we were asked then to look at this site, which was remnant bush. There had been some development on this corner, but the rest of it had remained undeveloped. And we actually developed a dwelling model, and we worked with a series of principles. I'm going to go for time, I should finish shortly. We developed a series of principles that informed what we were wanting to deliver, and our view is that it is essential to have these design principles in place so you can measure the outcomes against the principles which are the ambition of the project. And too few projects actually state what they're attempting to achieve other than maximising yield. So all these principles can be tested in terms of what you're looking for and the outcome. We developed a simple stair hall walk-up model, which meant that people's privacy was not invaded through access balconies. By having the stair hall, it allows you to have units with at least 2 faces, allowing cross-ventilation and solar access, and it allowed also a degree of deep soil for planting. Parking was taken to the back of the site, the surface was made permeable, and we planted in that surface. So again, this is something that needs to be looked at in more detail than time will allow here. But what our IRP4 unit is doing is developing a range of typological models like this for different water settings. This was the outcome of the Redcliffe project. I won't go into it in detail, as I said, but we are now doing the same for Knutsford in Fremantle, working closely there with Landcorp and the City of Fremantle. And we'll be overlaying types onto sites that are available, and they will be tested in terms of water mass, and they'll be tested also in terms of the potential of the precinct to be able to generate its own power and to reuse its own water. And our view is that we can do that at 100%. So we had a workshop on this topic maybe 3 weeks ago, and material will be generated from that, which will allow us to develop a series of proposals for the Knutsford site. There are some good case studies that we can look at around the area. The Knutsford, the first project that took off at Knutsford for Landcorp is a very good project done by Space Agency, an architectural firm in Fremantle, and they have developed from this another project for this site, which is called the Old Museum site, which really puts in place some more ambitious water-based targets and some more ambitious energy targets. We're working with the CRC for low carbon living on the Knutsford project. This is the museum site development. Again, there is more detail there than we are able to go into. Just to finish, we are generating many drawings like this, which analyses an as-is situation, and then we look at a business as usual infill type situation, and what might be done with some more design consideration on the site. And we're doing that for a whole variety of different settings. So in the end of the project, we hope to have a large database of opportunities that are developed from best case examples that we can find around the world. They will then be tested by our colleagues in Queensland to determine how they perform for different water settings. And we'll obviously be taking into account the kind of findings that Daniel has spoken of in his presentation, where we need to adapt locally the way we build, the way we design for different water settings. Thank you.